It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Two cities, London and Paris, bound together by roads, by letters, and by fate. On a lonely road outside London, in the year 1775, a mail coach struggled up a muddy hill through thick fog. Inside sat a passenger named Mr. Jarvis Lorry, bound for Dover, and beyond it, for France. A messenger on horseback rode up out of the darkness. He carried a message for Mr. Lorry, 3 words only: "We called to life." Alone in the swaying coach, half-dreaming Mr. Caffe, Lorry imagined again and again that he was digging a man out of a grave, a man buried alive for 18 years, and asking him always the same question: "Do you want to live again?" At an inn in Dover, Mr. Lorry met a young woman named Lucie Manette, sent for by Tellson's Bank. He told her, gently, that her father was not dead after all, but alive, and about to be found. They crossed to France, to a poor quarter of Paris called Saint-Antoine, where a wine cask had broken in the street. The starving crowd rushed to drink from the gutter, and someone wrote a single word on the wall in wine: blood. The wine shop belonged to Ernest Defarge, a stern, watchful man, and his wife Therese, who sat always knitting by the counter, her needles recording secrets no one else could read. Above the wine shop, in a locked garret, Defarge kept a secret. A man had been a prisoner in the Bastille for 18 years, in a cell known only as 105 North Tower. He now made shoes, and did not remember his own name. Waiting below was the daughter he had never known, come to find the father she believed was dead. When she saw him, the broken old man barely lifted his eyes, but when he heard her voice, something long buried stirred inside him. They carried him back to England, to begin again, recalled at last to life. 5 years later, in the dim and dusty offices of Tellson's Bank in London, an odd job man named Jerry Cruncher waited each morning on a wooden stool outside ready to run messages, his boots always strangely caked with fresh clay no one could explain. At home, Jerry's wife knelt often in prayer, which Jerry loudly resented, calling it flopping, and accusing her of praying against his secret business, whatever that business truly was. One day, Jerry was sent running to the Old Bailey with an urgent message from Mr. Lorry, where a young Frenchman named Charles Darnay stood trial for treason, accused of spying for France against England. 2 witnesses could identify him beyond doubt, they said, ready to send him to a traitor's death. But in the courtroom sat another man who looked exactly like the accused, a lawyer named Sydney Carton. Carton removed his wig and set it beside his own face, beside the prisoner's. The resemblance was so exact that the witnesses' certainty collapsed. Darnay was acquitted. Outside the court, Lucie Manette had watched the trial in terror for a man she barely knew. Darnay thanked her warmly. Carton watched them both and said nothing. Carton called himself a jackal, and his blustering colleague Mr. Court, Stryver the lion. Night after night, Carton worked alone by candlelight, preparing the cases that Stryver would claim credit for in court the next day. On quiet Sunday afternoons, the Manette household was full of warmth. Lucie's fierce and devoted maid, Miss Pross, ruled the little home like a general, guarding Lucie from anyone she judged unworthy. Miss Pross often spoke bitterly of a lost brother, Solomon, who had taken all her money years ago and vanished. She never stopped believing he would one day return a gentleman. In Paris, at a grand and glittering reception, an old aristocrat named the Marquis St. Everman moved among painted courtiers, utterly unmoved by the hunger starving the city just beyond the palace gates. Later, his carriage raced recklessly through a poor village street and struck and killed a child. The Marquis tossed a coin to the grieving father and drove on without stopping. That night, a stranger named Gaspard, the grieving father, followed the Marquis's carriage home and hid clinging beneath it as it crossed the courtyard gate of his great stone chateau. At dinner that evening, the Marquis's nephew Charles arrived from England, and told his uncle plainly that he wanted no part of the family's cruelty, and meant to renounce the Raymond name forever. That same night, the Marquis was found dead in his bed, a knife through his heart, a note left behind, "Drive him fast to his tomb." This from shock. Gaspard was hunted down, tried, and hanged above the very village fountain where his child had died, left there for a full year as a warning to the poor. Back in London, Charles Darnay asked Dr. Manette for permission to marry Lucie. The old doctor agreed, but asked one thing: never to be told Darnay's true family name until he chose to reveal it himself. Meanwhile, the blustering Mr. Stryver had also considered proposing to Lucie, certain she would be honored. A quiet word of caution from Mr. Lorry sent him hurrying off to convince himself he had never truly wanted her at all. On the eve of the wedding, Sydney Carton visited Lucie alone. He confessed that though he could never change, he loved her and would do anything for her and for those she loved. If it ever became necessary, Carton said, he would give his life for hers or for anyone she loved. She never forgot that promise. On his wedding morning, Darnay finally told Dr. Manette his true family name. The old doctor said nothing at first, but that night, without warning, he slipped back into his old madness and returned silently to his shoemaker's bench. For 9 days the doctor sat making shoes and did not know his own daughter. Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross cared for him in secret and told no one, until one morning he simply woke and remembered himself again. Afterward, in the dead of night, Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross secretly broke apart the shoemaker's bench and burned it piece by piece, so that it and that old life would trouble the doctor no more. Years passed peacefully. A daughter was born to Lucie and Charles. Dr. Manette, surrounded by love, grew stronger every year, and never fell back into the shadow again. Sydney Carton became a familiar visitor, the one person outside the family the little girl called her own. A special friend, though he never once let himself hope for more than that. Meanwhile, in Paris, the poor grew hungrier and angrier. In the wine shop of Saint Antoine, Madame Defarge sat quietly knitting, recording names in secret stitches, names of those who would one day pay. A fierce young woman known only as the Vengeance sat always at Madame Defarge's side, sharpening her hatred alongside her friends, waiting eagerly for the day of reckoning. A quiet mender of roads, later called Jacques Five, once told Defarge's circle the story of a tall, starving man he had seen months before, chained beneath a nobleman's carriage, hidden all the way to the chateau gate. The people of Paris rose in fury. On a July morning they marched on an old fortress prison, the Bastille, and tore it down stone by stone. Inside the fallen prison, Defarge forced his way to cell 115 North Tower, and searched every stone, looking for whatever Dr. Manette had once hidden there. Outside, an old official named Foulon, who had once said the starving people could eat grass, was captured by the mob. His mouth was stuffed with grass before he was killed in the street. Across France, the great chateau of the Evremondes was set ablaze by the peasants who had suffered under it for generations. It burned through the night, visible for miles. The old family servant, Gabelle, was seized and imprisoned in Darnay's name, and wrote a desperate letter to England begging for help, or he would surely be killed. Against every warning, Charles Darnay decided he must go to Paris himself to save the old man who had served his family faithfully. He told no one but Mr. Lorry and set out for France. His journey through France grew stranger and more dangerous at every stop. Stopped again and again at revolutionary checkpoints, watched by suspicious eyes, the France he remembered gone entirely. The moment he arrived in Paris, he was arrested as an emigrant aristocrat and thrown into the prison of La Force, held in secret, cut off from the world. Word reached London. Lucie and her father rushed to Paris. On the way, Mr. Lorry witnessed a grindstone in a bank courtyard, surrounded by men sharpening blades stained red, their faces wild in the sparking firelight. Dr. Manette, once a prisoner of the old regime himself, was now seen as a hero of the revolution, and used what influence he had to plead for Darnay's life. For 15 months, Darnay waited in prison, not knowing his fate. Each afternoon, at the same hour, Lucie stood at a certain street corner near the prison walls, hoping only that he might glimpse her from some high window. Near the prison, a wood sawyer joked grimly about the guillotine, calling it Little Saint Guillotine, and made a small game of pretending to chop off imaginary heads as he worked. At last Darnay was brought to trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Thanks to Dr. Manette's testimony, he was acquitted, and the crowd carried him home in triumph. But that same night, Darnay was arrested again, denounced this time by Monsieur and Madame Defarge, and by a third, unnamed accuser whose identity no one yet understood. Sydney Carton had followed the Manettes to Paris in secret, telling no one. Watching from the shadows, he began to understand the depth of Madame Defarge's hatred and how far it truly reached. In a low tavern, Carton confronted a nervous English spy named John Barsad, once thought to be Miss Pross's long-lost brother Solomon, and forced him to help, threatening to expose his secret work for both sides. At the new trial, an old letter was read aloud, written by Dr. Manette himself, hidden in the Bastille 18 years earlier. It told the true story of his imprisonment, and named the Evremond family as the cause. The letter revealed the truth. Darnay's father and uncle, the Evremond brothers, had wronged Dr. Manette terribly and imprisoned him to silence him forever. Darnay was condemned to death, sentenced by his own family's ancient crime. Carton learned the final terrible truth. Madame Defarge was the surviving sister of the family the Evremondes had destroyed years before. Her hatred would never be satisfied by anything less than the whole family's blood, including Lucie's child. That night, walking the dark streets of Paris alone, Carton bought a sleeping powder from a chemist and told Laurie the full and final shape of his plan. On the night before the execution, Carton visited Darnay in his cell. He made Darnay change clothes with him and drugged him unconscious with the powder. Barsad carried the unconscious Darnay out for the gates, disguised, and delivered him to a waiting carriage where Lucie, her father, and Mr. Pryder, Laurie were already prepared to flee Paris. That same night, Madame Defarge, carrying a pistol and a knife, set out for the Manette lodgings to denounce Lucie and her child as well. Determined the family's bloodline would end completely. Only the fierce Miss Pross remained behind to delay any pursuit, along with Jerry Cruncher, who had followed the family to Paris and finally confessed his secret trade as a resurrection man, robbing graves for money. Madame Defarge arrived to find only Miss Pross standing in her way, fierce and immovable, refusing to let her pass or discover that the family was already gone. They struggled. A pistol Madame Defarge carried went off in the fight. She fell and did not rise again. The blast left Miss Pross deaf for the rest of her life. Jerry helped Miss Pross flee the city, and together they raced to catch the carriage carrying the rest of the family safely toward the border and away from Paris forever. At dawn, the tumbrils rolled through the streets of Paris, carrying the condemned to the guillotine. Among them, wearing Darnay's face, rode Sydney Carton, calm and unafraid. Beside him in the cart was a frightened young seamstress, condemned for a crime she barely understood. Carton held her hand and comforted her gently, all the way to the end. As he waited his turn, Carton thought of the family he had saved and of the life he had never truly lived, but was now giving meaning to at last. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. Far from Paris, Lucie, Charles, their child, and Dr. Manette reached the safety of the coast and crossed the sea to England, never knowing until later the full price that had been paid for their freedom. Years later, it was said that Sydney Carton's face, in that final, peaceful moment, looked prophetic, as if he could see a future in which he was remembered, and the family he loved lived on in peace, generations after him. That was A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, a story of two men who looked alike and one final act that made all the difference. See you in the next one.